High on an outcrop beside the River Thames, dominating this part of the Thames Valley, is arguably the most famous fortress in Britain, if not the world. The site was chosen by William I for strategic reasons, for it was designed to visibly impose the Norman conqueror's will on the Saxons. Since those early fortifications of 1070, Windsor Castle has gradually grown beyond being a mere fortress, until today when it is the world's largest occupied castle. From the moment William the Conqueror laid down the plans for Windsor Castle, it was unique. Its central fortress, with a complex set of outer perimeter defences, was different to any other Norman castle, but then it had a special role. Windsor was part of a ring of 9 forts around London to protect the new capital. Overlooking the Thames, Windsor controlled the main access from the west. The river also meant that troops from Windsor could reinforce the capital very quickly. But more significantly, the castle provided an excellent base from which the king could go hunting in the former Saxon royal hunting forest. Undoubtedly, this vast area of greenness to the south of Windsor and the sport it provides has attracted monarchs to Windsor throughout the ages. The Curfew Tower is one of the oldest surviving parts of the castle. It dates back to the early 13th century in the days of Henry III, who, with his grandfather Henry II, completed the rebuilding of the castle and its defences with stone.
Well, the Curfew Tower is very special in the sense that it's one of 3 original towers that were built on the western side of the castle. In 1475, it was given to St George's Chapel by King Edward IV as its bell tower. So from here, the bells are rung for every royal birthday, for every saint's day, and for the major feast days in the Church of England. There's a cannon right at the very top, which is pointing towards the bridge at Eton. The other 2 features are a ringing chamber on the ground floor, but also off that is a sally port. Now, a sally port was the kind of emergency exit used when a castle was under siege. And the sally port is large enough to house 1 man on a horse going down to the bottom, which came out in the ditch. And so when the castle was under siege, it was a secret way out of the castle.
Henry III was also responsible for enlarging the royal apartments in the Upper Ward. The Upper Ward is the higher and more defensible part of the castle, where the sovereign resides. The part built on the side of the hill, below the Round Tower, where the soldiers and the royal staff traditionally live, is known as the Lower Ward. Another obvious attraction to the crown was the security and defence offered by the castle. Elizabeth I was one who sought refuge here when she learnt of plots against her throne. It wasn't just its position which made Windsor so secure, it also had a garrison, a situation which continues to this day.
Windsor Castle Guard, standards, east!
History Hit is a streaming platform that is just for history fans, with fantastic documentaries covering fascinating figures and moments in history from all over the world. We've got unrivaled access to the world's leading historians, with hundreds of documentaries featuring everything from Boudica to the British royal family. We're committed to bringing history fans award-winning documentaries and podcasts that you cannot find anywhere else. Sign up now for a free trial, and Real Royalty fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use code REALROYALTY at checkout.
The original garrison was stationed in the castle, and throughout its history there's always been a manned guard room. The garrison was initially required to man the castle's defences, defend the western approaches to London, and provide reinforcements if the capital should be threatened.
Subsequently, as Windsor began to be used as a royal palace, the garrison was required to act as royal bodyguard, protecting members of the royal family as they travelled to and from Windsor, and while they were staying in or near the castle.
The castle has only been attacked 3 times in its history, but its size and location has made it virtually impregnable. The one feature which stands out above all others at Windsor Castle is the famous Round Tower. Initiated by Henry III, it could have been inspired by the legend of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. It only served one king as a residence, Edward III, who was responsible for founding the oldest order of chivalry in the land, the Order of the Garter. More than 600 years later, and the knights still gather at Windsor once a year in the shadow of this great tower. The age of chivalry was the era when the concept of knighthood took on a whole new meaning. Edward III was the epitome of this new medieval knight, handsome, strong, brave, and religious. To many he seemed a reincarnation of the legendary hero King Arthur, and he did nothing to dispel such a thought. The story of the Order's inception is typical. To celebrate the capture of Calais, a ball was held in 1348. The king was dancing with reputedly the most glamorous lady in the kingdom, Joan, Countess of Salisbury, when her garter slipped to the ground. The king picked it up, and to the great amusement of his courtiers and fellow revellers, placed it on his own leg. But he reproached them by saying honnête soit qui mal y pense, which means shame or dishonour on him who thinks evil of it. Thus, the legend goes, is how the oldest order of chivalry and its motto was founded. It may sound inspirational and romantic, but in fact, it had a valuable political aim. It bound the magnates of the land more closely to the crown and solved the problem of administering a feudal kingdom. The select band would gather at Windsor every year to joust, feast, and pray. Today, there are 24 knights who attend the annual Garter Day procession and service. The service takes place in St. George's Chapel.
The principal role has always been as the shrine or chapel of the Order of the Garter. Each knight on appointment is allotted a stall in St. George's Chapel. In that stall, there is affixed a stall plate with the Knight of the Garter's coat of arms, so that if he is a commoner, before he receives the accolade, he has to have a coat of arms made specially for him. And Edward Heath was one, Harold Wilson another. Above the stall plate is a helmet on which is put the crest from the coat of arms. Now, the crest was a device which knights in the joust wore on top of their helmets so that it was possible to identify one competitor from another.
Although there's been a church near this site since the days of Henry III,
It was in 1475 that Edward IV began the present building of St George's Chapel.
Well, the present chapel was begun in 1475 as the King's private chapel, which adjoined the royal apartments. And it was at the end of the building period known as Gothic, the final flowering, in a sense, of the perpendicular Gothic period. Hence the very wide nave and the very, very large windows at both the west end and at the east end. It was a common thing in those times for the king to ask the Pope to exempt specific places from the authority of the church. Now, by so doing, the chapter at Windsor became responsible not to the Archbishop of Canterbury or to the local diocesan bishop, who was then the Bishop of Salisbury, but responsible to the sovereign alone. And because it was exempt, it was peculiar, and therefore St George's has been known as a royal peculiar. And today there are only two royal peculiars surviving: St George's Chapel in Windsor Castle and the College of St Peter at Westminster, otherwise known as Westminster Abbey.
Just up there in the chapter library, William Shakespeare's Merry Wives of Windsor was supposedly first performed. It includes, rather surprisingly, the character of Falstaff. Anyone who knows their Shakespeare will realise he first appears in Henry IV, which means to feature in the Merry Wives he would have to be at least 150 years old. Why? Well, Queen Elizabeth I commissioned the play, and Falstaff was one of her favourite characters. The bard also included one or two local legends, such as Herne the Hunter.
There is an old tale goes that Herne the Hunter, sometime a keeper here in Windsor Forest, doth all the winter time, at still midnight, walk around an oak with great ragged horns, in a most hideous and dreadful manner.
Herne was one of Richard II's huntsmen at Windsor. During one particular chase in the royal hunting forest, Herne saved the king from being gored by a stag, but was himself fatally injured. He would have certainly died had it not been for a stranger who emerged from the woods and bound a pair of stag's antlers to Herne's head. The mysterious cure appeared to work, and the king was so relieved he promised Herne that if he fully recovered, he would make him the head huntsman in gratitude for saving his life. The other huntsman was so jealous that they threatened to kill the stranger if he managed to save Herne's life. The wizard predicted that although Herne would become the head huntsman, he would not hold the position for very long. Sure enough, when Herne took up his new duties, he had so little luck finding sport for his master that he quickly lost favour and was dismissed. He was so distraught that he hanged himself from one of the great oaks.
It soon became known as Herne's Oak, and though replaced a couple of times, this one, planted by King Edward VII at the beginning of the century, is very close to where the original stood.
The reason the legend lives on is that Herne and his hounds can occasionally be heard engaged in a ghostly pursuit through the park. The former head huntsman still wearing his bizarre headdress of antlers.
Elizabeth was an avid hunter herself and an excellent horsewoman. She was still riding to hounds at the age of 66. She loved Windsor and had intended to be buried here, but in the end she's not one of the 10 sovereigns whose remains are within the vaults of St George's.
I think the special thing about St George's is to explain a lot of England's history, which lies here around us to many people who visit. I think people go away a lot wiser for knowing that their history is based here in one place.
The kings buried here span some 500 years. Their memorials can be found in various parts of the chapel. However, most are in the chancel.
Here then, as we move towards the altar, we come to the royal vault, which King George III commissioned and had built in St George's Chapel. Two of his children sadly died in 1810, 1811, and were buried in cramped conditions in Westminster Abbey, and this is what caused him to have a new royal vault excavated here.
Who's the oldest monarch, or what's the earliest monarch to have
the
been buried?
Lancastrian sovereign being King Henry VI.
And this tomb here is whose?
Yes, His late Majesty King Edward VII, House of Saxe-Coburg, and his consort Queen Alexandra. King Edward died in 1910. The tomb was executed here by an Australian sculptor, and in fact they carved King Edward's pet terrier, his dog Caesar, who outlived him and walked in his funeral procession, and he lies at his master's feet. Caesar's buried in the pet cemetery at Sandringham.
One of the other monarchs buried here is Charles I. On the 30th of January 1649, Charles became the only king to have been executed by Parliament. The castle's fortunes during his reign mirrored exactly those of the crown and country. When the Civil War commenced in 1642, Windsor was betrayed to the forces of Parliament without a shot being fired, the only time it has ever been taken. Under the control of the Puritan forces in Parliament, Windsor experienced its darkest days. The Dean and Canons were evicted from St George's, their horses slaughtered, and the chapel plundered. The King's collection of pictures and works of art was sold, and they even tried to sell the castle. It was also used as a prison for, amongst others, Charles. It was from Windsor that Charles was taken to London to face trial and later execution at Whitehall. His body was brought back here to be buried, and while the vault was being prepared, the dismembered corpse was laid out on this table and his head sewn back onto his body. As the funeral cortege moved down the hill towards the chapel in February 1649, it was bitterly cold and the Thames had frozen. The skies grew darker and a heavy snowstorm swept over the castle, covering the black velvet drapes and turning them white. The restoration of the monarchy in 1660 revived the fortunes of the castle and in turn the nation. The country had grown tired of being governed by saints and bigots and major generals. They wanted a change, and Charles II was only too happy to oblige. He was an extremely shrewd and diplomatic sovereign who united the nation once more. The fact that he too had suffered and was now determined to have a good time was perfectly in tune with the country. The interior of the castle was lavishly redesigned in Charles II's distinctive Baroque style, the most spectacular being the private chapel and St George's Hall. However, possibly the most visible legacy of Charles's work is the Long Walk. This connected the home park to the Great Park and what remains of the old Royal Hunting Forest. The 3 Mile Avenue is a spectacular tribute to the man who is most responsible for the very existence of the Great Park. It had suffered considerably after the Civil War, when Cromwell broke up the park and sold it off as farmland. It took Charles II some 10 years to buy it all back for the crown and virtually re-establish the old forest. As with all royal hunting forests, the red deer roamed free and were only fenced out of places where they were not wanted. Today, the deer are fenced into a deer park established in 1979. Much of the park that exists today was laid out by the infamous Duke of Cumberland, George II's son, who defeated Bonnie Prince Charlie at Culloden Moor and incurred the nickname Butcher Cumberland. Cumberland Lodge is named after him, and the obelisk and pond were created as part of the vista from the lodge. Originally, it had Culloden inscribed on it, but because of the connotations, Queen Victoria had it altered to Cumberland. Another of William Cumberland's landscaping schemes is Virginia Water. Supposedly named after Elizabeth I, it was the largest ornamental lake in Europe, stretching more than a mile. Even today, it's an impressive sight, bordered by the Valley Gardens. Perhaps the most famous monument in the Great Park, though, is the Copper Horse. This statue of George III was raised by his son to complete the view up the Long Walk.
It's said that there was a race to make the statue, and that in the sculptor's haste, he forgot to include the stirrups. Nice story, but sadly completely untrue. But it did take two people to make it. Geoffrey Wyatt built the base, and Richard Westmacott the statue.
It's a fitting monument, for George III enjoyed Windsor and the park. Nicknamed Farmer George, he established two farms, Flemish and Norfolk, which still exist. The King much preferred the rural atmosphere at Windsor to the court life of London, where he felt uneasy and suspicious of those around him. Advised that the castle was unsuitable, the King and his family resorted to the Queen's Lodge on the south side of the castle. When in 1796 George engaged a new architect, James Wyatt, he moved into the castle proper, but oddly elected to live below the state apartments on the cold north side. It was under his son, George IV, that Windsor was to experience its period of greatest change.
On his 62nd birthday in 1824, George IV laid the foundation stone to a new archway to link the Long Walk to the Upper Ward. It was the first stage in a massive remodelling of the castle, which he undertook with his architect Geoffrey Wyatt, better known as Wyattville.
King George IV was very much aware that Britain had become a very powerful nation after the Battle of Waterloo, and he was determined that Windsor should become the symbol of that power and prestige of Britain. And therefore he was determined that the outline of the castle should look more impressive, that it should continue to be Gothic in style, but the dramatic outline was the increase height of the round tower was one of the most obvious things. It had been a low round tower before the 1820s. And afterwards it became 30 foot higher and is the sort of the dominant feature, which is very well known. He moved the statue of King Charles II from the centre of the quadrangle to underneath the round tower, and so Windsor Castle as we know it, and as the public knows it, as the world knows it, is really the creation of King George IV, particularly the round tower, and indeed all the other battlements and Gothic towers and additions.
George IV began a metamorphosis which changed Windsor from an historical relic into a functioning palace, a process which has continued to this day, especially since my parents opted to make Windsor their home. However, since the days of William I, Windsor has been a home to a thriving community.
At no time has the castle's relationship with its surrounding community been more clearly demonstrated than during the dreadful fire of 1992. In a desperate bid to save the contents and the treasures, help appeared from everywhere: the castle, the park, the town, and the barracks.
The very fact that Windsor is a home made the loss all the more personal, and in a sense forged the determination of my parents to restore the castle.
Also, perhaps it's symbolic of how the perception of the castle has changed, from the oppressive fortress built by William I to one which its community wishes to save under Elizabeth II.
There is probably no other place anywhere in Britain which is more closely associated with the crown and the nation than this castle, which has stood on the historic and dramatic site of Windsor for more than 900 years. Anyone who drives along the south coast of England cannot help to notice signs like these outside a number of towns, 30 to be precise. However, few travellers are likely to know just how important the Cinque Ports were, or the extraordinary deal that existed between the Crown and these ports, which gave them tax exemptions and special privileges. It was a deal that was to be the basis of England's maritime power for nearly 500 years, and the beginnings of a relationship with my family that continues until today. This underground passage is part of a massive network of tunnels below Dover Castle, which guards the most important and the most influential of all the Cinque Ports, Dover.
This tunnel is right in the middle of what is known as Hellfire Corner, so called because Dover has so often been on the front line. Once earmarked as a nuclear fallout shelter, these tunnels only came off the top secret list a few years ago. The evacuation of Dunkirk in 1940 was organised from here, as was the famous Dover Patrol, which attempted to keep the English Channel open throughout the First and Second World Wars.
These tunnels are the latest element in a history of defences stretching back over 900 years, and the struggle to control the Straits of Dover. Dover overlooks the narrowest point of the English Channel. France and the continent of Europe are a mere 22 miles away, and on a clear day with a pair of binoculars, you can even see the clock in Calais town square.
Inevitably, this was England's most frequently attacked stretch of shoreline. The question of how to defend it has troubled the inhabitants of these shores from the very beginning. Even the Romans, in spite of building 3 forts here 2,000 years ago, couldn't stop people from attacking. It was Edward the Confessor who first thought of the solution, a regular supply of local ships and skilled men loyal to the crown. In 1050, King Edward formed a confederation of 5, or in French 5, ports: Hastings, Romney, Hythe, Sandwich and Dover. In later years, they were added to, and at their height in the 14th century, there were at least 18 ports stretching from Seaford in the west right up to Brightlingsea in Essex. The Cinque Ports' duty was to supply ships and crews to defend the country from sudden attack and to provide transport for the king and his army.
Not only were they vital to the kingdom's defences, but the Cinque Ports are where England's maritime power began.
In those days, ships were of a simple design and built on the beaches. The crews were mostly fishermen who knew the Straits of Dover and the English Channel better than anyone. Their skill as seamen was unrivalled. They developed a unique style of combat, which involved throwing clouds of acidic quicklime in their enemies' faces and then ramming them. For the idea to work, it was essential the Cinque Ports were loyal to the crown. Edward the Confessor proposed a deal which allowed them extraordinary privileges.
Effectively, it was self-government for the Cinque Ports in return for providing a almost basic navy and also rights of passage across the Channel. The quid pro quo from the portsman's point of view was self-government. The ability to levy taxes, the ability to run their own courts and to punish criminals, and bearing in mind we're on a coastal area, the important benefit of salvage which came ashore, salvage on the sea and from wrecks.
And was this very unusual at the time?
I think it was probably quite exceptional, probably the only case where it occurred. And it was based totally on mutual dependency on each other. The Crown needing the ability to move and to defend the coast and move across to France. And the portsmen in turn getting the privileges and ensuring the loyalty through those privileges.
The arrangement stayed in place for nearly 500 years, during which time the Cinque Ports fleet managed to cover itself with glory, and its battle honours are as distinguished as any contemporary regiments.
They were the navy of the time. Any major conflict at sea, they were a major force in. Richard I and the Crusades, the relief of Dover in 1216, the Battle of Sandwich, the 100 Years' War, Henry VIII's campaign, and the defeat of the Spanish Armada.
So who really benefited from this deal?
I think it was one of those deals where both parties benefited. The Crown had access to ships and men who were loyal because, in fact, the benefits from their point of view were good. And the portsmen rapidly turned the privileges, the exemption from taxation, their own courts into quite good living in terms of profit and in terms of trade.
Service to the Crown was not just restricted to the sea. Many cinque ports have their own royal connections. The town of Rye is perhaps the best example of a cinque port. It has remained virtually unchanged since the late 14th century and owes much of its history to its cinque port status, acquired in 1156. It became styled Rye Royal in the 16th century, and typically of so many cinque ports, is now virtually landlocked, with the coast almost 2 miles away.
Rye's harbour was once one of the best along the south coast. 30 ships could be moored near the Strand Quay, with as many as 200 being able to anchor in the old estuary. Rye's commitment to the Crown as a cinque port was the supply of 5 ships a year. Like any cinque port, Rye's strategic importance made the harbour and town an obvious target for marauding pirates.
On one occasion, the French stole the church's bells and installed them in Saint-Pierre-en-Port and Volat-sur-Mer on the Normandy coast. The following year, the men of Rye enlisted the help of neighbouring Winchelsea, and they raided the town, successfully recapturing the bells.
Rye had a unique attraction for the French, for it had once been owned by them. King Canute's wife, Emma, granted Rye and other local lands to the Abbot of Fécamp early in the 11th century. Only when Henry III, in 1247, built Rye's defences, notably the Ypres Tower, was the town brought directly under the English king's control. The curious name of a local village, Rye Foran, is possibly a reminder that the Abbot of Fécamp retained a small area in the hinterland of Rye.
Of all the town's connections with the Crown, the most spectacular must have been Queen Elizabeth I's visit here in 1573.
Well, a royal progress was really to show herself to the people. The Queen had to be seen by the people. She was a sort of icon, really. She'd be on her litter, in her carriage, looking like a painting, literally, and with the makeup, a lot. And she would have been staying with various courtiers en route. I know that she stopped at Northiam on her way here. She must have arrived here sort of towards evening, because I believe she had a meal at Northiam underneath the old oak tree outside the pub at Northiam. And the pub itself cooked the meal for her, and she danced on the village green. She was a great dancer, Queen Elizabeth I. And she wasn't an absolute spring chicken in 1573, not by the standards of the 16th century, but she used to love dancing, all the latest dances. And that was where she left her shoes behind, of course, at Northiam, her green silk slippers. It cost a fortune to entertain the Queen, and something like 400 or 500 retainers. The town had to borrow money for her visit, as she did tend to just clean everybody out that she stayed with. They borrowed £100. But the whole clue was that for these courtiers, the very presence of the Queen was their sort of meal ticket, if you like. They were in her favour. They continued in her favour. And it was a continuous game in the 16th century to be in the favour of the sovereign. So really it was in their best interests. Not long after that, she renamed Rye Rye Royal. And we still use that title sometimes, even today.
And where did she stay when she came here?
It's probable that she stayed in this house that we're in at the moment. This is Green Hall, opposite the church. And the Mermaid round the corner, the Mermaid Inn.
Apart from naming the town Rye Royal, there was an incident which left a rather unusual reminder of Queen Elizabeth's visit here. In this lane, Traders' Passage.
One of the ladies-in-waiting was charged with the duty of looking after the Queen's valuables and jewels. Amongst the treasures was a necklace of beautiful and extremely rare black pearls. But during the stay in Rye, they somehow went missing.
Of course, the whole town was turned upside down trying to search for the pearls, but they were never found. The lady-in-waiting was racked with guilt, for she was convinced she'd lost them.
Ever since, passers-by swore that they had seen the spirit of that poor woman searching in vain for the pearls.
The story becomes even stranger, though, for after an air raid during the Second World War, the long-lost pearls were supposedly rediscovered just a few yards from here. Yet, within hours, they had utterly vanished once more, and the ghost has never been seen since.
The Mermaid Inn plays another part in Rye's and the Cinque Port's history, an altogether more sinister one. With the introduction of customs duties by Edward I, the town became a warren of secret passages and priest holes, a hive of illicit activities. Rye fell under the control of an illegal industry, smuggling.
By imposing the duties, it created an opportunity for people to avoid them. And I think that's where the portsmen came into their own, and that's really where piracy and smuggling became the name of the game from their point of view. The Crown, in return for its privileges, had effectively given them their own court system, their own system of government, and they could, through those, avoid any penalties.
There were several gangs. The worst gang of all was the Hawkhurst gang, led by George Grey. He was able to have 500 men at his side just for the asking, and if a customs officer came in, they'd know exactly what to do and how to deal with him. I believe one of the people they caught was actually nailed to his own front door for informing on them. One of our ghostly sightings, we have a lady in grey who's been seen on several occasions walking along the corridors. And she's supposed to be a barmaid here once who got involved with the smugglers romantically. But she was actually caught informing on them and they had her killed. And it's supposed to be her spirit that walks the corridors here today.
It was not just goods like brandy, tobacco and tea which were smuggled. Secret passages and chambers, like this priest hole up a chimney, were perfect for smuggling Roman Catholics in and out of the country. Even the old tuck shop had a special pulley system to hide away the occasional barrel of brandy. The customs officers were regularly outnumbered and outmaneuvered.
This is where the wretched customs officers had their headquarters. They had the most dreadful time because there are far too few of them and far too many very, very cunning smugglers. There were various gangs. The Hawkhurst gang is the most famous one. They would do a smuggling job, escape the customs officers, these wretched people, and then later on in the evening they'd be found round the corner at the Mermaid, just drinking and laughing at the expense of these people. The smuggled goods having been moved through pretty quick to some fence a bit further north, and of course the attics of Rye. They were the way the smugglers could escape the customs officers, because they knew their way. All the attics of Rye interlink to this day. They could go up the back stairs, through the attics, and then nonchalantly emerge from another house round the corner and disappear.
Although Edward I could not have foreseen the results of his decision to impose duties, smuggling and the odd bit of piracy never detracted from the serious task of defending England's shores. But for all their successes, the Cinque Ports fleet were not totally infallible.
In 1377, the French, in spite of Henry III's elaborate defences and the fact that they no longer had a claim on the town, still managed to burn Rye to the ground. However, A little further down the coast, in 1066, the most serious violation of the Cinque-Port fleet's defences occurred. Admittedly, the fleet had been called away to the north of England by King Harold in his successful defeat of Edrada of Norway, but it left the south coast open for William, Duke of Normandy, to land, unopposed, at Pevensey Bay. Harold was defeated at the Battle of Hastings, and all of England was conquered.
All? Well, not quite. William I came here to Dover soon after the battle and renewed Edward the Confessor's deal with the Cinque-Ports, ensuring their loyalty and privileges and securing his own beachhead and access to Normandy. Thus, the Cinque-Portsmen argue that William I was not their conqueror, for he never actually defeated them.
The castle at Dover bears all the hallmarks of a Norman fortress, with its square keep. But in fact, William did little more than strengthen the existing Saxon hill fort. The inner walls and magnificent keep, the largest ever constructed at the time, was the work of Henry II.
Well, Henry appears to have been a bit of an oddity at the time. He travelled generally with a fairly small entourage, unlike most monarchs of the period. And indeed, he seemed to quite enjoy roughing it, staying at local inns and things like that. The stories are that when he was hunting, for example, he would frequently end the day in the woodland, dismount, roll himself up in his cloak and doss down where he was, which didn't go down too well with the entourage that he took with him.
He had a temper. He had trouble with his wives as well. He married Eleanor of Aquitaine, but he also took a mistress. And the mistress was the Fair Rosamond, and he used to meet her when she was hidden in a maze, and he used to find his way there by a piece of silk. You can imagine this. I'm coming, again, trying to find your way through this maze, either in or out. But his wife found out, and she wasn't too pleased with this, and she was quite possessive, and made the comment of, you're going to die. Choose. It's either poison or the knife. And I think she chose the knife, and she bled to death.
At this time, England's empire amazingly stretched from the border with Scotland in the north as far as the Pyrenees in the south. Yet Dover was a frontier port, facing as it did the French king's territory of Flanders. In Dover Castle, Henry built a highly visible deterrent.
It was known in the 13th century as the Key of England. Mainly because if you take this castle when you're invading England, then you could protect your reinforcements, and then you could you would have captured England. This is the nearest point to France anyway. We can see them on a good day, like today, and they can see us, and therefore they wanted to come across.
In 1216, towards the end of the reign of King John, the barons rose in rebellion and called on Prince Louis of France to claim the crown of England. Well, Louis came to England with a vast army, and within a matter of weeks, most of the southeast of England was under French control. Dover, however, under the control of a man called Hubert de Burgh, Dover Castle held out, and so did Windsor. Towards the end of 1216, Prince Louis laid siege to the castle here. And the siege lasted 6 to 8 months. The action came towards the end of that period when the French drove a mine under what was then the main gate. They collapsed the main gate, the French infantrymen got in, and the area that we're standing in now was the scene of very bloody hand-to-hand fighting. Hubert de Burgh managed to force the French back out, make good the damage on a temporary basis, and the siege continued. King John then very conveniently died, the French went home, and the castle survived to fight another day. Just behind us is an area where King John had a home built, and indeed Richard the Lionheart. Richard I spent 6 weeks here. Now, bearing in mind that he only spent 6 months of his 10-year reign here in England, to get 6 weeks here at Dover was quite something. Indeed, in the church, St Mary in Castro, there are graffiti marks or crusader marks carved into the walls by members of his entourage.
Dover is unique amongst the Cinque Ports. It's the only one to still have a major functioning port. During the 16th and 17th centuries, many of the ports along the south coast began to silt up, and as the Crown needed bigger boats carrying cannon, the emphasis shifted to the larger harbours, like Portsmouth.
The last time the Cinque Ports fleet took part in a major campaign was against the Spanish Armada in 1588, but the days of ramming the opposition were over.
Firepower was the way ahead. So while the role of the ports and the fleet declined, with the consequent loss of privileges, the need for defence remained. Many of the fortifications along this part of the coast date back to the threat of invasion during the Napoleonic era. Dover, due to its strategic location and proximity to London, was the key to Britain, so its defence was vital.
Even the defences are now largely redundant. What was once the Guardian of England has now become known as a Garden of England, and all that remains of the links between the Crown and the Cinque Ports are one or two rather splendid traditions.
Every year, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother comes to stay at Walmer Castle, just 8 miles from Dover. Her role is to carry out the duties of Lord Warden, a position she has held since 1978. The full title is the Lord Warden and Admiral of the Cinque Ports and Constable of Dover Castle, a role that has been in existence for over 800 years. The Queen Mother follows in a long line of wardens that include Winston Churchill, the Duke of Wellington, Viscount Palmerston, and George V when he was Prince of Wales. But Queen Elizabeth is the first lady to hold the position. Walmer Castle was built in 1539 by Henry VIII as part of a chain of defences aimed at forestalling a possible invasion by Charles V, King of Spain and Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire.
Fortunately for Henry, the threats never materialised, and Walmer was never put to the test. Now the castle has a more peaceful role as the official residence of the Lord Warden.
The original duties were to keep the sailors of the Cinque Ports in check. Because they had the privilege of setting up their own courts, it often meant some illegal acts like piracy were conveniently overlooked. The Lord Warden, in providing a direct link between the monarch and the portsman, was often placed in a very difficult situation. The other privilege and tradition which has continued is the portsman's right to carry the canopy above the monarch's head during the coronation service, a position which demonstrates in ceremonial terms that the Cinque Ports are at the very heart of the kingdom and demands enormous trust on the part of the monarch.
It may seem old-fashioned, but in respecting these few traditions, my family acknowledge the Cinque Ports' long and glorious history. In coming here each year, my grandmother in particular continues the unique relationship between my ancestors and this part of the country.